Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to Rican Muslim. I'm your host, Rican Muslim. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. So, yeah, I'm still kind of perplexed how people still believe all the lies they're still being told after repeatedly over and over again being shown just how much the West has lied to them, how much they're corrupted, and how much they pretty much make up things just to follow a hidden agenda that always causes lies, destruction, and death. So today I figured, you know what? Let's take a look into Saddam Hussein, about how evil he really was. Let's begin.
Who was Saddam Hussein? According to most Americans, he was a murderous, bloodthirsty dictator, an enemy of freedom and democracy. To the Kurds, he was a brutal, genocidal maniac who murdered thousands of rebels with poisonous gas. To many Iraqis, he's a heroic martyr who died fighting the great Satan of American imperialism. To the Jews and Christians living in Iraq, Saddam was a protector who respected their religious freedom and sheltered them from persecution. During his reign as president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein built roads and bridges. He electrified the countryside. He provided free healthcare and education. In the 90s, he created mandatory reading groups for adults. Those who failed to attend received jail time. The result? Iraq's literacy rate rose from 52% in 1977 to 80% in 1987. But in 2003, President George W. Bush launched a massive invasion. Tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians were slaughtered. Saddam Hussein was overthrown, hunted down, and executed. Why? Why did George Bush bomb this country to smithereens? Why did America sacrifice thousands of young men to overthrow this regime? Why is Saddam Hussein remembered as a bloodthirsty tyrant? Most importantly, what can his downfall teach us about American interventionism, the Israel lobby, and the future of the Middle East? Saddam Hussein was born in a tiny village in northern Iraq to a tribe of Bedouin shepherds. Before Saddam was even born, his father died, leaving his mother so depressed that she tried to commit suicide. A kindly Jewish family stepped in and stopped her from killing herself. So throughout his life, despite his later opposition to Israel, Saddam always had a soft spot for the Jewish people.
Weird. So, Jewish people, Israel. There is a difference.
As a child, Saddam was beaten and abused by his stepfather, so at the age of 10, he fled to Baghdad to live with his uncle, Khairallah Talfa. Talfa was a veteran of the Anglo-Iraqi War and had served 5 years in prison for resisting the British invaders. He often regaled his young nephew with tales of his exploits fighting the imperialists. At the age of 20, Saddam Hussein dropped out of law school to join the revolutionary Ba'ath Party. The Baathists were nationalists who wanted to unite and modernize the Middle East. They believed that Islamic extremists were dividing the Middle East through pointless religious wars, and they wanted Arabs to unite under one banner. The founder of Baathism, Michel Aflaq, was a Christian, so Baathists believed in religious freedom for Jews and Christians alike. They sought to create a Middle East that was prosperous, peaceful, and independent. While serving in the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein made a living as a high school teacher. But in 1959, President Nasser of Egypt offered Prime Minister Qasem of Iraq an alliance, a union between Egypt and Iraq. The Baathists, of course, believed in uniting the Arab world, so they urged Qasem to accept the alliance. But Qasem was working with the Iraqi Communist Party, who opposed the union. He sided with the communists and turned down Nasser's offer. So the Ba'ath Party decided to assassinate him. young Saddam was sent to kill the president of Iraq. Unfortunately for Saddam, whether out of nervousness or lack of experience or both, he fired too early. The assassination failed, the whole operation fell apart, and Saddam fled to Egypt, where he lived in Cairo under the protection of President Nasser. When Saddam finally returned to Iraq, tensions were high. In July 1968, the Ba'ath Party staged a bloodless coup, and Saddam personally led the prime minister at gunpoint to the plane that escorted him out of Iraq. Saddam began climbing the ranks of the new government, and in 1979, he formally took power as president of Iraq. As president, Saddam brought electricity to almost every city in Iraq. In 1982, he built the Saddam International Airport in Baghdad. Though he instituted some socialist policies like free healthcare and education, Saddam was critical of Marxism because of its atheism, and because it called for conflict between the rich and the poor, which Saddam saw as dividing the people when they should be uniting towards a common goal. Still, he admired some communist leaders, such as Castro and Ho Chi Minh, not for their economics, but for their nationalism and for their struggles against imperialism.
That's a problem. Struggles against imperialism. Yeah, he didn't know that he's not allowed to have his own opinion. Nope, not in the Middle East, you're not. Because he's got masters.
President Saddam tried to unite all the different cultures within Iraq. Sometimes he wore traditional Bedouin clothing, sometimes he wore full Islamic headdress and robes, sometimes he even wore Kurdish clothes. But most of the time he wore a modern military uniform, reflecting his vision of Iraq as a modern, developed nation that had put aside ethnic squabbles. Of course, Saddam would eventually kill thousands of Kurds during the Anfal campaign in the dark final years of the First Gulf War. But in the early years of his regime, the Kurds were treated well. He allowed them to speak Kurdish in schools and on TV. He even allowed the Kurdistan Democratic Party to elect representatives in the national government. One of Iraq's 3 vice presidents was Taha Ramadan, a Kurd. One of the key tenets of Baathism is religious freedom. To be clear, this is not the same as secularism. In 1977, Saddam stated that, "Our party does not take a neutral stance between faith and atheism. It is always on the side of faith." Unlike the Western Enlightenment religious tolerance that really amounts to state atheism, Saddam's religious tolerance meant protecting Jews and Christians from persecution. He helped restore the Baghdad synagogue, and he built a new Jewish cemetery. Though Saddam was Sunni Muslim, Shias, Jews, and Christians all held prominent positions in his regime. According to Cardinal Filoni, the Vatican's ambassador to Iraq, Christians were able to freely practice their faith. In 1979, Father Jacob, the priest of a Christian church in Detroit, gave a speech praising Saddam for his kindness to Christians. Hearing this, Saddam donated $250,000 to Jacob's church. Jacob was of course overjoyed, and the mayor of Detroit allowed him to travel to Baghdad and present Saddam Hussein with a ceremonial key to the city of Detroit. At the ceremony, Saddam asked him, "I heard there was a debt on your church. How much is it?" When Jacob told him, Saddam donated another $200,000. Years later, when Saddam Hussein was overthrown and killed, Father Jacob spoke bitterly about the war and America's refusal to compromise. "Saddam was good for Christians," he said. "Now he's murdered, and look what happened."
Yeah, and that's you see that a lot, and I think it's actually what they want. That's actually what they want. They want to see it. They want to destabilize. They don't want to see peace. They like the death and destruction, and that's all now what the Western values are really all about: death, destruction, people keeping people down, and well, and it's just indentured servitude. You know, they have to be indentured servants to the West, and they're not allowed to do anything else besides that. And if they don't play ball, that's what happens.
Saddam's key to Detroit was never found. Presumably, it was destroyed by American bombs or buried in the rubble of Iraq. Over in Iran, a fundamentalist Islamic government had taken power. Its supreme leader was Ruhollah Khomeini, a solemn, aloof Islamic scholar. While Saddam believed in nationalism, Khomeini believed in theocracy. While Saddam was respectful towards Christians, Khomeini refused to eat at restaurants unless he knew for sure that his waiter was Muslim. Khomeini called for Shia Muslims across the Middle East to revolt and create Shia theocracies. As you might imagine, that made Saddam pretty nervous. Saddam was Sunni, but the majority of his people were Shia. If they revolted and imposed a Shia theocracy, there would be nobody to protect the Sunni and Christian minorities. So, in 1980, Saddam launched an invasion of Iran. His goal was to capture Khuzestan, a province on the border of the two nations, which held key oil reserves and was also home to substantial Sunni and Christian minorities. By the way, America actually supported Saddam in this war. So did Europe and most of the Arab world. They saw Khomeini's fundamentalism as a threat to peace and stability, so Saddam was celebrated as an agent of the civilized world, standing up against Islamic extremism.
And actually, in Islam, that's actually acceptable. He did that to protect other Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Jews for what was coming, the oppression that was coming. It was an attack on for self-defense, but yet nobody really talks about all those things.
But in the end, after 8 bloody years, the war ended in a stalemate. Over 1 million died, both economies were left in ruins, and Saddam Hussein was deep in debt. In particular, he owed $30 billion to the tiny nation of Kuwait. Kuwait is one of the richest nations in the Middle East, largely because of foreign investment from the West. You can probably see where this is going. Saddam asked Kuwait to help a brother out and forgive his war debt. Kuwait refused. Desperate to make some money, Saddam urged his fellow oil-exporting nations to cut back on drilling so that Iraq could raise prices. Kuwait refused. Saddam accused Kuwait of being controlled by Western investors and acting in the interest of financial institutions rather than the interest of its Arab brothers. Kuwait just laughed him off.
Which is what every single Muslim leader does, is they bow down to the needs of the West. They don't care about the lives of their actual Muslim brothers and sisters. And most of them are just traders. They're just there for money, the dunya, and nothing else. So he's right about that.
And the Emir of Kuwait declared his intention to bankrupt Iraq and turn every Iraqi woman into a $10 prostitute. That was the last straw. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein launched an invasion of Kuwait. As the fighting raged, the Western media published story after story about the supposed atrocities of Saddam Hussein. The stories got more and more ridiculous and reached their peak when a young Kuwaiti woman testified at the UN that Saddam's soldiers had broken into a hospital, taken babies out of their incubators, and left them to die on the floor. It later turned out that the story was completely false and that the young woman who testified was actually a member of the Kuwaiti royal family.
Wonder if we've seen this before. Recently, something like this, I wonder. Stop me if you heard something like this similar, huh?
But nobody cared. The damage was done. As far as the American public was concerned, Saddam Hussein was literally Hitler. So in January 1991, President Bush Sr. launched Operation Desert Storm. For 42 consecutive days and nights, Iraq was bombed relentlessly. It was one of the most intense bombing campaigns in military history, destroying villages and infrastructure, crippling the nation, and killing thousands of civilians. Eventually, Saddam was forced to retreat, with over 85,000 casualties. To punish Saddam further, the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq, causing extreme economic hardship. This blockade caused shortages in food and medicine, leading to the deaths of around 500,000 Iraqi civilians. But despite all the sanctions, despite the full strength of the Atlanticist powers working to tear him down, Saddam Hussein made a recovery. From 1996 to 2001, Iraq's real GDP grew from 45 billion to 103 billion. And we can't have that, can we? In 2003, a new crisis was haunting America. The rumor of the day was that Saddam Hussein had acquired weapons of mass destruction. But of course, we all know how the story ends. When the dust settled, the weapons of mass destruction were nowhere to be found. We now know that there never were any WMDs, and the war in Iraq was based on lies. Even at the time, this was pretty obvious. The documents claiming that Niger had sold uranium to Iraq were clearly fake. One document, supposedly written in 2000, was signed by a Niger Minister of Foreign Affairs who had been out of office since 1989. How did this happen? How was the Bush administration deceived by such an obvious lie? Well, the truth is, they wanted to be deceived. You see, the Bush administration was led by a group of politicians known as the neocons, who believed in spreading liberal democracy by the barrel of a gun. As prominent neocon Michael Adim put it, every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall, just to show the world we mean business. Paul Wolfowitz, one of the leaders of the neocons and the Deputy Defense Secretary for the Bush administration, had been calling for decades for America to depose Saddam. These neocons had been waiting for any excuse, any opportunity to invade Iraq. So, when reports came out that Saddam had WMDs, they didn't look too closely. But why did the neocons hate Saddam so much? Did they genuinely see him as a threat to America? Did they genuinely think he was gonna nuke New York City? Well, maybe. But the truth is that all these neocons had ties to the Israel lobby.
Always. And of course, you mentioned that you're a conspiracy theorist, even though it's all played. As you can see, you can connect all the dots. But yeah, it's all like this is real. This is real. Over 1 million people died. All this starvation, all this famine, all of this was constructed and done at the behest of the Israel lobby, and people applaud it. Even people still applaud it today. People still applaud it today in the United States. Thousands and thousands of American lives, soldiers died for no reason whatsoever. Meaningless deaths all across the board, and people still applaud it, and people still believe whatever they're told. Amazing.
According to William R. Polk, they had an affinity bordering on patriotism for Israel. And Israel wanted war. Former Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu both wrote op-eds urging America to invade Iraq. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called Iraq the greatest threat to Israel. Is it possible that the real reason these neocons wanted war was because the Israel lobby was funding their campaigns and running their think tanks? Take John Bolton, Bush's Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Bolton was so vehemently pro-Israel that in 2006, an Israeli ambassador to the UN joked that Bolton was a secret member of the Israeli ambassador team rather than the American team. The secret is out. We really are not just 5 diplomats. We are at least 6, including John Bolton. Bolton was a scholar for the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, whose advisory board also included Dick Cheney. In an interview on CBS, Saddam made it very clear that he did not have weapons of mass destruction, and he challenged President Bush to a live televised debate. Bush refused. On March 20th, 2003, the United States launched a massive invasion of Iraq.
During a short lull, ambulance crews took to the streets to tend to civilian casualties. The last arrived here as an air raid siren was going off just before dawn. John Irvine, ITV News, Baghdad.
Within 3 weeks, the Iraqi government collapsed. Saddam's sons and his 14-year-old grandson Mustafa were killed by US soldiers. Between the chaos, the bombings, and the collapse of the Iraqi healthcare system, over 1 million Iraqis died by the end of the war.
كأنما احنا العراق مثلا عندنا وبغداد يعني بصورة عامة.
Oh yeah.
هم كانوا يدعون بها سقوط بغداد. وهاي الكلمة يعني تأثر من الهواي. هذول الاثنين بير وبوش. هم رجعونا للصفر. يمكن أقول لك رجعنا للقرون الوسطى وأكثر. أنا لو مجرم يعني أقتلهم بداية. أيوة.
In December 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured by American soldiers. He had been hiding in a hole in the ground near his childhood home. Saddam was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging.
الحكم على المدان صدام حسين المجيد بالإعدام شنقا حتى الموت لارتكاب قتل عمد كجريمة ضد الإنسانية وفق المادة 12 أولا أليف بدلالة المادة 12 أولا ثانيا ثالثا رابعا.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. May Allah reward him for the last few words. And may Allah grant him Jannah. May Allah forgive him his past sins. Because this was an atrocity. Lies that killed if he deserved the death penalty, what does the U.S. and every cabinet person and all of Congress deserves for the million of people that died on a lie, complete lie, all fabricated? What did they deserve for the thousands of American soldiers that died for no reason? Nobody ever mentions that.
Saddam Hussein spent his final days in a prison cell, guarded by a team of American soldiers. According to the soldiers, he seemed more like a grandpa than a murderous dictator. They allowed him to plant a garden near his cell and to smoke his favorite Cohiba cigars. He told them that Fidel Castro had gotten him hooked on smoking. While in prison, Saddam asked if he could watch The Passion of the Christ. As he watched it, he grew enraged at the way Jesus was being treated. In a fury, he declared that the Iraqis would have treated him better. He added that The Passion of the Christ was the best movie he'd ever seen. This wasn't the only time he showed a strange affinity for Christianity. He once told his guards that, every year on Christmas night, he would light a candle with his family. When the time came for Saddam to be executed, he wrote a poem for his guards, saying he wished they could be back home in America, celebrating Christmas with their families, instead of guarding him in Iraq. When the Americans handed Saddam over to the executioners, he stopped to shake each one by the hand and whisper a few private words. As he was led to his death, he turned to them one last time and said, "God be with you." While the executioners fastened the rope around his neck and tightened the noose, Saddam prayed quietly to himself. He was cut off mid-prayer when the trapdoor opened and he fell and broke his neck. He died instantly. Since the death of Saddam, Iraq has not become a flourishing liberal utopia, as the neocons hoped. Instead, it has seen an al-Qaeda-led uprising, a religious civil war, and the rise of ISIS. In 2011, ISIS declared a caliphate over large swaths of the country, and was defeated in 2017 by yet another grueling war, yet again led by the US. The point of this video is not that Saddam was a perfect leader. Far from it, he did many terrible things. His genocide of the Kurds was genuinely brutal, and his invasion of Iran was a huge mistake. But by far the greatest mistakes were made by the US. Our interventionism, as usual, only made the situation worse, and Iraq was left in ruins.
Yeah, but the thing that nobody mentions is that it was left in ruins on purpose. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to leave it in ruins because they wanted, well, the resources. They didn't want Saddam to use their oil, and have it be theirs. Because even though Iraqi oil was in Iraq, the West believed that Iraqi oil was theirs, just like everything else. And that's what happens. When you speak up against tyranny, that's what happens when you speak up against evil. And yeah, millions of lives lost, thousands of lives lost, a country in ruins, still in ruins, all based on a lie, by hidden agendas, and nobody ever mentions that. Everybody just forgets about it, kind of brushes it off like it didn't even happen. It's sad. But I hope this kind of sheds a little light on some things that I've known about, but thanks to social media, we could share more about it so people could really know the truth. Let me know what you guys think. Till next time. Peace.